beginning the first of the year, I started a series on individuals from the Old Testament that we can glean from, that we learn from. And the life lessons from Moses reveal lessons that every faithful follower of Jesus Christ should apply to their life. And so I want to look this morning to the life of Moses. If you remember, we've looked at Abraham, and then we looked at Jacob, and then we looked at, you remember last week? Anyone remember last week? They were gone. So Joseph, and now we look at Moses. If you can tell, we're kind of following our way through the beginning of the Jewish people. And we look now Moses. Probably of all of the characters in the Old Testament, Moses is the most predominant. Both in the Old and New Testament, you see studies and life and examples from Moses. His name, Moses, means drawn out. Drawn out. I thought that would be a great name for a preacher, because preachers have the ability to take something and draw it out and make it last and last and last and last. But Moses' name obviously means drawn out, because you know he was the one who drew the nation of Israel out of bondage and into the promised land. He grew up to be one of the spiritual giants of the Bible. After the death of Joseph, it says that a new Egyptian Pharaoh came on the scene. It says that a Pharaoh came on the scene that did not know Joseph. Well, he knew Joseph, but he had no significance to him. He had no idea of the predominance or the blessings that Joseph brought into the kingdom, the Egyptian kingdom. And so this particular Pharaoh became afraid. The natural reaction to coming into the presence of God is one of two. You either fall at his feet and worship him, or you're repelled and you are afraid of him because you know of your own sin. In this particular case, this Egyptian Pharaoh repelled away from God and became afraid of God and became afraid of the nation of Israel. So much so, he said, they're more than we are. And if they decide to take over, they can simply take over our kingdom. And so what he did is he enslaved the people. Moses was the man chosen by God to deliver those people out of bondage. God's mighty hand was seen through the life of Moses, most likely more than any other Old Testament character that you can imagine. Actually, Moses writes the book in which we get most of the information about him, the book of Exodus. And he writes Deuteronomy. I can't imagine someone writing Deuteronomy. At one point, he says he wants to number the people of Israel. And so what does he do? He takes a census, and there's a book in the Old Testament called Numbers. And so you have the first 5 books of the Bible were written by this guy, Moses. You know them as the Pentateuch, we call it. Now, a very quick and deep look into the life of Moses reveals a lot of great lessons for each of us to learn. Matter of fact, these lessons will take you the rest of your life to learn. They're not something like mathematical equations that once you have them down, that you can move on. They're lessons that you rework and rework and rework almost every day of your life. If you'll look with me, Hebrews chapter number 11, we'll start in verse number 23, and we'll read as follows. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born. You know the story? How that the Pharaoh became afraid of the people of Israel, thought that they were more than the Egyptians, and so one of the edicts was, we're going to have to get rid of all the boys. And so all the boy babies were to be drowned in the river Nile. But Moses' parents had faith in God, and they do something incredible. They see in this child something more than any other. He was no ordinary child, the scripture says. And they were not afraid. Remember I said 2 natural reactions to God? One is that of fear, the other that of worship. Here you see the response of Moses' parents. In faith, they were not afraid because they knew God. And individuals who know God are generally not afraid. And in this case, not afraid of the Pharaoh's edict to kill the babies. I think I could elaborate a little bit on killing babies. That seems to be in the news today, doesn't it? Sad state of affairs. That when somebody of some authority, supposable authority, can get up before you and say, it's not a person unless we say it's a person. It's not a human being unless we declare it a human being. And you can kill it anytime you want, right up to the time that it's born. For those of us who know God and cherish life, it's a strange, strange world that we live in. In verse 24 it says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, you know the story. He's put there in a basket. He's floated down the Nile. It just so happens, I've always wondered if it was just so happens, the Pharaoh's daughter was there, and she finds Moses. I know that is of God, but I'm wondering if Moses' parents knew that there was a certain time Pharaoh's daughter was going to be there. I always kind of wondered that. But at any rate, you know, at the right time, Pharaoh's daughter sees this baby floating in the Nile, is drawn to it. It's no ordinary child. She takes the baby and ends up raising it as her own, except that it's a newborn. We know he was, 3 months old. He needs a nurse. And who ends up becoming Moses' nurse but his own mother? What a deal. God, in his providence, taking care of details that we couldn't imagine how they could take care of. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up there in Pharaoh's house as part of the ruling class, educated in Egypt, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. And again, a characteristic of this guy that is unique. Forethinking. Looking at more than just here and now. Is there a lesson there? Yeah. Verse 26 says, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater value than the treasures of Egypt. I was thinking how he knew of Christ. How did he know? that there was going to be a Redeemer. Prior to this, it was kind of handed down from generation to generation through word of mouth. We actually have Moses to be the first one to actually write down these promises that God would provide a Redeemer, a Savior who would come. And Moses saw that that was far greater than the treasures of this world. And he looked forward to that coming of Redeemer as a reward. In verse number 27, it says, by faith, he left Egypt. He didn't fear the king or the Pharaoh in his anger, but he persevered because he saw him who is invincible. The him there should be capitalized, huh? Because we're talking about God. By faith, have you heard this over and over? A characteristic of Moses? By faith. He kept the Passover. And he sprinkled the blood on the doorpost and the mantle as the death angel passed over. You know the story? He did that by faith, so that the destroyer or the death angel would not touch the firstborn of Israel. As we look at verse 29, by faith, it says the people of Israel passed through the Red Sea, and they didn't get muddy, but rather on dry ground. And when the Egyptians tried to do it, they drowned. All of the characteristics of this one called Moses. And most of us have watched the Exodus. Most of us have seen Charlton Heston play the role of Moses. But very few of us have taken the time to think about how that this man Moses is an example for each one of us in his life and the life lessons. First of which is the fact that he wasn't proud, but rather humble. In Numbers chapter number 12, verse number 3, it tells us, now the man Moses was very humble. Listen to the rest of this. More than all men who were on the face of the earth. God told Moses, write this down. You're the most humble person on the entire planet. When I wrote that, I says, you know something? That'll never be said of me. I'm way too proud. I have way too much pride in my life for that to ever be my characteristic. And yet, it's a desire. For God resisteth, remember this from King James language? God resisteth the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So the natural question, at least in my little mind, is, okay, I agree. How could you disagree? It said Moses was the most humble person on the face of the earth. So how could you disagree? So the natural question is, okay, I agree with you. But so what? How does that apply to me? How is it possible to be humble? Well, if you know much about the life of Moses, you know that his parents and grandparents were from the tribe of Levi. He was part of the class of Jewish people that were going to be priests, who were going to stand between God and men. And when Israel grew in number, you know the story, how that they said, we got to get rid of these people. How that his mother throws him into the river, and yet ends up being his nurse, and he grows up in the most prestigious of households. I was trying to relate to some kind of American family that you could place in the idea of growing up and how your life would be different if you grew up in that family instead of the one you grew up in. Your life would be different, wouldn't it? With the prestige or money or education or background. It'd be very, very, very easy to become proud. I've had a privilege, mainly because of my older brother, of knowing people who were very, very, very influential. I'm thinking of a guy who's passed away now. His last name was Prechter. Came as a German immigrant to the United States. Mingled and worked to, ended up in a factory in Detroit. And had it in his mind that if we cut a hole in the top of a car roof, that people would like to look out. So he made a window in the roof. And as time went along, he learned how to put electricity to the window so that there was an electric window. You know that window as a sun roof. Mr. Prechter became extremely wealthy over the idea of putting windows in roofs. Now, after a little time, he said, I wonder what it would be like if the whole top came off. And Mr. Prechter is the first person who figured out how to cut a top off and make it a convertible. Now, can you imagine the royalties, just the royalties off of those two ideas? Mr. Prechter was extremely wealthy. I mean, he had his own, at that time, I think it was a G2, they called it, $25 million jet airplane. The nicest of nice things. His family, he and his wife bought the house that Fisher Brothers built in Detroit. Has anyone ever heard of Fisher Brothers? Because back in the day, if you opened a General Motors car, on the nameplate down on that, it said body by Fisher. What's my point? Mr. Prechter was extremely sensitive to the fact that English was his second language. And he spoke with a really heavy German, call it roll. He was sensitive to how people saw him. And he was sensitive to how he was perceived. And the last thing he wanted anyone to think was that he had anything. Mr. Prechter flew in on a $25 million jet in blue jeans and a flannel shirt. And after he got away from the people, he never knew that he had a nickel. I remember the day that I was there with Mr. Prechter, and I was going to preach the next day in the local Baptist church. And he looked at me and he says, when you get up to speak, what accent are you going to use? He was sensitive of his accent, and he picked up on accents. I didn't think I had an accent. So I went ahead, and the way I responded was that I grew up in Detroit, and that when I was 17, I moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, and that every once in a while my mind hits a greasy spot, and I slip right into Southern. And he laughed. He thought that was funny. And I looked at Mr. Prechter, and I said, Mr. Prechter, I'd like to ask you to do something for me. Mr. Prechter had millions of dollars. Possibly hundreds of millions of dollars. And we were sitting in this great big room with a great old big fireplace, and that was his hunting lodge. And he was ready for me to ask for money. You could see it in his eyes. Because that's what every preacher does to this guy. They ask for money. I looked at Mr. Proctor and I said, Mr. Proctor, I'd really like to ask you to do something for me. And he said, what is it? And I said, I would like for you to convert my brother to being a Republican. He looked over at my brother and says, you're not a Republican? Like, why are you here if you're not? It was in that same room that they talked George Bush W. into being the president of the United States and to run for presidency. It was that kind of person. I've never met anyone that had more, but yet was so humble. It said that Mr. Proctor never forgot that his parents didn't have dirt to be farmers, and that he started out learning mechanics because they couldn't afford to send him to school. To this day at Michigan State University, there's a building called the Business School that has his name on the door. It was my privilege to get to meet him. I can't imagine Moses growing up in the most affluent family in not the country, but the world, and having the education at his disposal, anything that you can imagine, and turning it all aside and walking away and saying, I will serve God above all that. But he teaches us a lesson. The value of following the Lord. You know his life story. I don't need to get up here and elaborate too much, do I? I mean, there was one point in which he thought, okay, this is it. I'm in the right place at the right time, and I'm going to deliver my people. And he sees an Egyptian beating an Israelite, and so he goes in and intervenes, and he kills the Egyptian, only become afraid to run away and to serve God on the backside of the desert as someone who is despised, a shepherd, from the royal family to the least of all. Says that he flees to Midian, become a shepherd, the most lowly job, and one in which the Egyptians despised. I need to speed this up just a little. But I couldn't go through the life of Moses without first talking about humility. How do you learn humility? Number one, you realize that God is so much greater than anything else that you can possibly see or know or understand. Number two, you go through some of the most horrible experiences of life. You know that you're never supposed to pray for patience, right? You know that. If you pray for patience, the way you get patience is you go through trials and difficulty. Don't pray for humility either. Because humility comes from being debased and put down and turned aside. The second lesson that I want you to look at in the life of Moses has to do with who's in charge. You see, this whole idea of fighting battles and depending upon the Lord to fight the battle for you, that's saying God is God. And you are of little significance. And that God, when you're with him, fights the battles for you. I turn to another person. In the life of Moses, it's very dramatic. I mean, he's got this famous scene of at the Red Sea, and every time I think of this, it's Charlton Heston. I can't help but doing it. But he parts the Red Sea, and all of the nation of Israel crosses over. And then when the Egyptians try to do it, it closes in on them, and they all drown. Who opened the Red Sea? God did. Who closed the Red Sea? God did. What did Moses do? He followed God. And when you follow God, He takes care of the battles. There's a rule. There's a great lesson in life. If you have to knock the door down to make something happen, it's probably of you and not of God. If you have to make it happen, if you have to finagle it, do you know what the word finagle means? I didn't figure you did. Manipulate. You know that word? Make it happen behind the scenes so that up front it doesn't look like you're doing it. If you have to do that, no matter what you're talking about, it's probably of you and not of God. I was trying to think of another Bible character that I could point to. I had to learn this lesson of letting God do the fighting and we follow. Many of them, but the one that came into my mind was Gideon. In the Old Testament, you got these people that are my relation. They're of my lineage. If any of you follow family trees, their first names were Phil, and their last name was Tynes. And normally you pronounce it Philistines. But their name is Phil Tynes, and that was my background, my people. And they were always against God. And God's people were always fighting with the Phil Tyneses. And there was a guy by the name of Gideon who was told that he needed to go over and whoop up on the Phil Tyneses. And he gathers together everyone he can to go over there with him. And you remember what God said? I don't need all these people. And so he lines them all up and he says, I want you to tell these people something. Anyone here that's afraid can go home. Anyone know this story? Anyone know this story? Oh, okay. I'll move on. And so a whole bunch of people that's in the army of Israel, they go home. And that's not exactly the way to win battles, but it's the way God told Gideon to do it. A little bit later, he says, I tell you what, you still got too many. And there's hundreds of thousands of these Phil Tyneses that are out there. And there's not very many at this point that are not afraid. And so God tells him, you take all of the army and you go down to the river and all of you take a drink. And every single person that bows down to the river, you send them home. But the people who take the river and lift it up to their mouth, you keep them. Well, a whole bunch more people go home. What was God doing for Gideon? I don't want you to think that you win the battle. I don't want you to think that you're responsible for this victory. So here's what I want you to do. I want you guys, and there ends up only being about 300 of them against 10,000. He said, what I want you guys to do is I want you all to get a pot, clay pot. I want you to put a candle down in the clay pot. I want you to light the candle. In the middle of the night, I want you to encircle this great big camp of Phil Tyneses. Anyone know this story? And here's how I want you to fight these people. I want you, at one point, all of you break the clay pot and yell real loud. And then what do? Just sit here and watch. You know the story? They jumped up in the middle of the night. They were so afraid. They saw all these lanterns all around them, and then all these people yelling that they grabbed their sword and they started killing one another. And the whole point of the story is, who does the fighting? God does. God does. And our great lesson here from Moses is the fact that when he was trying to do this, it failed. But when he let God do it, God demonstrated his power in the plagues over Egypt that today most people know the plagues of Egypt. And they know that it was of God. Number 3, accountability. As humble and submissive as Moses was, he wasn't perfect. If I had to write the story, I'd have left this part out. I would. I mean, if it was up to me to write my life story, I'm not writing a story where I messed up and failed. I'm not necessarily writing a story where I got arrested or other things. You didn't know about that, did you? Anyway, don't write about that. But Moses wanted you to get a lesson here. And he learned a lesson. It's accountability. God said something, and he means for us to follow. Now, in all of the examples of Moses, you see him as this great leader, but you have to realize that leaders are followers, and they're accountable. What's the adage that you've heard is unchecked power leads to corruption, or something to that effect? An absolute corruption is identified by those who have absolute power. Moses teaches us accountability. He's taken the children of Israel from Egypt over to the promised land. And these people aren't very cooperative. I said that nice, didn't I? And at one particular time, they don't like what's going on. And what do you do when you don't like what's going on? You naturally don't blame yourself. You blame the leader, right? Our God-given right as an American citizen is to blame the leadership. And that's what the nation of Israel did. They blamed Moses. And so Moses takes the petition to God. God, what am I supposed to do? And in one sense, these people are right. They're thirsty and this is a dry land. What are we supposed to do? And so God had a plan. Did you know God had a plan? And a lot of the Old Testament plans of God actually reveal something that's going to take place in the future. We sang a song, "On the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." Who's the rock? Jesus is the rock. He's the rock of our salvation. In the Old Testament, God told Moses, you go over there and you strike that rock and water's falling out. And Moses did that. And it was a great miracle. And a little bit later, they got in the same situation. And God said, what I want you to do is you to see that rock over there, you just talk to the rock. You just speak to it. And water will flow out of it. But Moses kind of thought, that's dumb, talking to rocks. I remember when I hit the rock and water came out of it. And so I think what I ought to do is hit the rock and water will come out of it. And he didn't do what God said. You see the picture? The rock is Jesus. He's going to be struck for our sin. And he's going to gush forth with the salvation of living water. And after that, he doesn't get struck again. He's crucified once for all. And then to get salvation, what do? You just ask. Moses didn't get the picture. He failed to read the whole memo. He struck the rock. He was supposed to talk. Cost him greatly. Because of that, God said, you've led these people out of Egypt. I mean, you're a man that you and I can talk face to face. But you didn't follow me in my word. And so because of that, there's consequences. Have you ever learned that there's consequences for doing it your way over God's way? Moses learned it. Generally speaking, those lessons aren't real fun. But God says, because you hit the rock when I told you to talk to the rock, you don't get to go into the promised land. And you're going to die before you get there. And Moses did. And it said that God loved him so much, the Bible says that God buried him, not Joshua. Well, another lesson, the fact that he had to talk about the treasures of heaven rather than the treasures of this world. And I talked a little bit about that, and the fact that he separated himself from Egypt, knowing that heaven was his home. Oh, if there's a lesson to be learned. That the things of this world grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. But what is the greatest lesson that I think I could tell you of Moses? If this is it, and you never hear another word from me about Moses, what's the one thing that I want you to take away? That he's humble? That's pretty big. That he trusted God? Important. But I think the greatest thing that you could learn is the fact that he had a personal relationship with God. Personal relationship with God. Like many of the other faithful followers of men and women we see throughout the Bible, of all of the people that you see having a relationship with God, Moses. Everyone else spoke to man, God spoke to man through something. It says that Moses at one point says, I don't want to just hear your voice. I want to see you. And he says, Moses, as a human, you can't look upon me. Not now, not while you're in the flesh. And Moses says, but God, I want to see you. You remember what God did? God says, I want you to stay here in what's called the cleft of the rock. I thought of it as a cave. And I want you to turn your back upon the opening of the cave. And I am going to let you see the glory as I depart. You don't get to see me face to face. But as God left, the glory of God shined. And it says that God covered Moses with his hand as the glory of God departed. As a result, you know what happened? Moses actually glowed with the presence of God. Have you ever met anyone that glowed? I mean, pregnant women have a glow about them. Don't they? Yeah, you know what I'm talking about in that? But you ever met somebody that it just seemed that either their personality, their voice, their mannerisms, they were of God? It's a rare thing nowadays to find someone that has a relationship with God so much that it seems that they talk to God and God talks to them. I've met people that told me that God talked to them. By looking at their life, I generally disagree. I've had people tell me that God told them. I normally smile and realize that if you have a personal relationship with God, it shows. It shows. And out of all of the characteristics of Moses, this idea of having a closeness to God. I was thinking about Exodus 33. So the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. You have someone that's like that in your life? You talk to? Like a friend? When you have a true friend, you don't worry that they're going to turn on you. You have a true friend, you don't worry about hiding and putting the mask on, do you? Because they know all that anyway. You're 100% honest. A friend. What would it be like to have God as your friend? In Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse number 10 it says, "But since then there has not risen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." I thought, you tell a friend everything. There's nothing to keep back from a friend. And the importance of having God as your friend. I suppose that Moses, in my mind, was destined to deliver the people of Israel from bondage and slavery from the time he was born. And in that sense, he was like our Savior. Destined to be our deliverer. A man that was humble and meek. As Jesus has said, did not think it was right to claim equality with God, but rather humbled himself as a man. A life that teaches us vital lessons. The lessons that have to be learned over and over again. Lessons that develop within a person. So that at the end of our life, they might say, he or she was like God. And instead of praising us, what do? They know that it's all because of him. And they praise our Father who is in heaven. Pray with me, if you will. Father,